In the small town of Aldermere, where winters were long and summers were short, there lived a boy named Elias Thorne. He had no father that anyone remembered, and his mother died when he was 15, leaving him alone in a world that did not seem to care whether he lived or starved. He slept in the back room of a tannery, where the smell of leather and salt never left his clothes, and he worked from before sunrise until long after the moon had risen, just to earn enough coins for a single meal a day. Nobody in Aldermere expected much from Elias. He was quiet, thin, and often overlooked. The wealthier families in town barely noticed him, except when they needed extra hands to carry heavy loads or clean out storerooms. He did not complain. He simply worked and waited, though he was not entirely sure what he was waiting for. The winter he turned 17 was the hardest one Aldermere had seen in many years. Snow fell for 11 days without stopping, burying the roads and freezing the wells. The tannery closed because no one could reach it, and Elias found himself without work, without pay, and without food. He had a small stash of dried bread that lasted him 2 days. After that, there was nothing. By the third day without eating, his hands had begun to shake. His stomach ached with a hollow, gnawing pain that made it hard to think clearly. He wrapped himself in a thin blanket and sat by a small fire he had built from scraps of wood, wondering if this was how his story would end, alone, forgotten, and cold. It was on that third day that someone knocked on the tannery door. Elias almost did not answer. He assumed it was the wind, or perhaps someone looking for shelter who would be disappointed to find him there instead of the tannery owner. But the knock came again, firm and patient, so he pulled himself up and opened the door just enough to see who stood outside. It was a young woman, bundled in a wool coat that had clearly been mended many times. Her cheeks were red from the cold, and snow dusted her dark hair. In her hands, wrapped carefully in a cloth, she held something that steamed gently in the freezing air. "You are Elias, from the tannery," she said. It was not really a question. He nodded, too surprised to speak. "My name is Marta. My family bakes bread near the market square." She held out the cloth bundle. "I noticed you have not been to buy bread in several days. I thought you might need this." Elias stared at her, unsure what to say. He did not know this woman well. He had seen her perhaps a handful of times, buying supplies at the market, or helping her father carry sacks of flour. She was not wealthy. Everyone in town knew the Voss family baked bread for the poorer parts of Aldermere, and earned barely enough to survive themselves. Yet here she was, standing in the snow, offering him a warm loaf. "I cannot pay you," he finally managed to say, his voice rough from days of silence. Marta shook her head. "I did not ask you to pay me. I asked if you needed bread. Eat it while it is warm." She pressed the bundle into his hands, and before he could think of anything else to say, she turned and walked back into the storm, her boots crunching against the fresh snow until she disappeared from sight. Elias sat by his small fire that night and ate the bread slowly, savoring every bite as though it were the finest meal he had ever tasted. It was simple bread, made with simple ingredients, but it was warm, and it was given freely, and for the first time in days, he did not feel entirely alone. The next morning, he expected that to be the end of it. A single act of kindness, perhaps born from pity, never to be repeated. But when he opened the tannery door to check on the weather, he found another loaf waiting on the step, wrapped in the same careful cloth. This continued for 11 days, for as long as the storm kept the town buried in snow. Every morning, without fail, a loaf of bread appeared at his door. Sometimes Marta brought it herself, exchanging only a few quiet words before leaving. Other times, when the wind was too fierce even for her, her younger brother delivered it instead, saying only that his sister had sent it. Elias never asked her why she did it. He was afraid that asking might make her stop, or worse, that she might realize she was wasting her kindness on someone who could never repay her. But on the last day of the storm, when the sky finally cleared and the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, Marta appeared at his door one final time. "The roads should be clear enough for you to reach the market tomorrow," she said, handing him the last loaf. "You will not need me to bring you bread anymore." "Why did you do it?" Elias asked, the question finally escaping him. "You do not know me. Your family has little enough for yourselves." Marta considered the question for a moment, as though she had not really thought about the reason before. "I do not know," she admitted. "I simply could not stop thinking about you being alone in this tannery, with nothing to eat. It did not feel right to have bread, and know that you had none. That is all." She smiled at him then, a small, genuine smile that Elias would remember for the rest of his life, and walked away without waiting for a response. Elias never forgot those 11 days. He carried the memory of that bread, and the woman who gave it, through every hardship that followed, and there were many hardships still to come. In the years after that winter, Elias worked harder than anyone in Aldermere had ever seen. He took on extra jobs, saved every coin he earned, and slowly began to understand the leather trade in ways that even the tannery owner had not considered. He learned which hides sold best in the larger cities, which merchants paid fairly, and which routes were safest for transporting goods. By the time he turned 22, he had saved enough to buy a small share in the tannery itself. From there, his fortune grew steadily. He expanded into shipping, using his knowledge of trade routes to move goods more efficiently than his competitors. He invested in land when prices were low, and sold when they rose. Every decision he made seemed to work in his favor, as though the hardship of his early years had taught him lessons that wealthier men, who had never known hunger, could never fully understand. By the time Elias reached his 30s, he was no longer the poor boy from the tannery. He was Elias Thorne, one of the wealthiest and most respected men in the entire province. He owned warehouses in 3 cities, ships that carried goods across the sea, and land that stretched further than anyone could walk in a single day. With wealth came attention, and with attention came many women who wished to become part of his life. Daughters of noble families arrived at his door with dowries of gold and promises of political alliances. Wealthy widows offered him land and connections to powerful families. Ambitious young women from merchant houses brought him gifts, flattery, and carefully rehearsed words meant to win his affection. Elias was polite to all of them. He attended the gatherings, danced at the celebrations, and listened to their offers with careful attention. But something always felt hollow about these exchanges. Each woman who approached him seemed to be offering something in trade, as though his affection was a prize to be won through the right combination of wealth and charm. None of them asked about the boy who had once gone hungry in a tannery. None of them seemed to care about anything beyond the powerful man he had become. He often found himself thinking back to that winter, to the simple loaf of bread and the woman who had given it, without expecting anything in return. He wondered, sometimes late at night, when the halls of his large house felt too quiet, what had become of Marta Voss. He learned, through careful and quiet inquiries, that she had married a carpenter from Aldermere a few years after that winter. She had 3 children, lived simply, and continued to help her family with their small bakery whenever she could. She had never remarried into wealth, never sought out powerful connections, and had, as far as anyone could tell, no idea that the boy she had once fed was now one of the richest men in the province. Elias thought about visiting her many times over the years, but something always held him back. Perhaps he worried that seeing him now, dressed in fine clothes and surrounded by servants, might make her feel as though her simple kindness had been transactional all along, as though he owed her something and had come to repay a debt. That was not what he wanted her to feel. Her kindness had never been about debts. It was not until Elias reached his 50th year, after decades of building his empire, that he finally returned to Aldermere. He did not arrive with servants or fine carriages. He wore a plain coat, much like the ones he had worn in his youth, and walked through the town without announcing who he was. Much had changed in Aldermere. The town had grown into a small city, with new buildings replacing the old wooden structures he remembered. But when he reached the market square, he found that the bakery was still there, weathered by time but standing exactly where it had always been. He pushed open the door, and a small bell rang above him, announcing his arrival. Behind the counter stood a woman with silver threading through her dark hair, her hands dusted with flour, as she arranged loaves of bread along the shelves. "Good afternoon," she said, glancing up briefly before returning her attention to the bread. "What can I get for you?" Elias found that his voice had suddenly left him. He stood there for a long moment, simply looking at her, at the small lines around her eyes that came from years of laughter and hard work, at the same careful way she wrapped each loaf in cloth. "A loaf of bread," he finally said, "whatever kind you would recommend." Marta selected a simple loaf, still warm from the oven, and wrapped it carefully before holding it out to him. As their hands met over the counter, she paused, studying his face more closely. "Do I know you?" she asked slowly. "You look familiar, though I cannot quite place where I might have seen you before." "You knew me a long time ago," Elias said quietly. "During the winter storm, many years past, I was the boy from the tannery who had nothing to eat." Recognition slowly dawned in her eyes, followed by disbelief. Elias? Elias Thorne? She had clearly heard his name over the years, as everyone in the province had, but had never connected it to the thin, hungry boy she remembered. He nodded, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "I never forgot what you did for me," Elias finally said. "Every day for 11 days, you brought me bread and asked for nothing in return. I have thought about that kindness more than you could possibly know." Marta seemed uncertain how to respond, clearly overwhelmed by the realization that the poor boy she had helped so long ago now stood before her as one of the wealthiest men in the province. "It was such a small thing," she said softly. "I never thought about it again after that winter ended." "It was not small to me," Elias replied. "In all the years since, many people have offered me gold, land, and every kind of alliance imaginable. But you were the only one who ever gave me something, when I truly needed it, without wanting anything back." He did not offer her money that day, though he easily could have. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else in his life, that Marta had never wanted anything in exchange for her kindness, and offering her wealth now would somehow diminish what she had given him all those years ago. Instead, in the months that followed, Elias quietly funded the construction of a new building at the edge of town. A place where children from poor families could learn a trade and always have access to a warm meal, regardless of their circumstances. He named it simply, without ceremony, choosing words that honored what had once saved his life, without drawing unnecessary attention to the woman who inspired it. Marta never sought credit for the building, and Elias never insisted she take any. She continued baking bread in her small shop until she was far too old to stand at the counter, and even then, her children continued the family tradition. Years later, after Elias Thorne had passed away, those who managed his estate discovered a collection of personal journals he had kept throughout his life. In one entry, written many years after that final visit to Aldermere, a single line appeared, underlined twice, as though he had wanted to make certain no one could overlook it. He had written that every woman who had ever come into his life brought him gold, or land, or power, or promises of things he did not truly need. Only one woman had ever brought him something simple, warm, and freely given, when he had nothing at all to offer in return. She was the only one he had never forgotten. The building he funded still stands in Aldermere today, though few who pass by know the full story behind its creation. Above its door, a small plaque remains, its words simple and unadorned, "For the bread that was never asked to be repaid."